On a cool, sun-washed morning in late June, the small village of St. Oswald's Hollow bustled with an unusual sense of occasion. It was the day of the bishop's annual breakfast, a tradition going back nearly 40 years, where the bishop of the parish would host a refined morning gathering in the rose gardens behind his residence. Villagers spoke of it fondly, for it combined polite conversation, scones, marmalade, fresh tea, and the chance to observe one another under the pleasant guise of civility. Miss Jane Marple had arrived punctually, as she always did. She moved with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who never missed a detail. Not a misplaced napkin, nor a tremor in a voice. Though her hair had turned perfectly white, and her hands were thin as pressed linen, her eyes retained their soft sharpness, a gentle blue, too kind to seem dangerous and yet far too observant to ignore. The bishop's garden glowed with early summer roses, pale pinks and soft creams arranged in tidy arcs. The tables set for breakfast were covered in crisp white cloths, shining porcelain, and a silver tea service polished so bright one might see the sky reflected in it. The bishop himself, the Right Reverend Malcolm Everdane, was a distinguished man with a warm, if slightly absent, smile. He was known for gentle sermons and a rather philosophical stance on sin, often saying that most sins were born more of foolishness than of malice. He was beloved. His guests this morning included Mrs. Clarissa Everdane, the bishop's wife, elegant, graceful, but with a tremulous edge to her smile, as though she always braced for something unsaid. Edmund Pritchard, the young curate, earnest, full of admiration for the bishop, though his nerves showed in the way he kept smoothing his hair. Mrs. Agatha Tilling, the town's most enthusiastic gossip, already armed with several rumors she hoped to release with the dramatic flair of a magician producing rabbits from a hat. Colonel Aubrey Fenton, Fredimensdurst, stiff as polished oak and twice as rigid in his opinions. Miss Lydia Marsh, a quiet woman of about 30, recently returned to the village after years abroad, though where she had been, precisely, remained vague. And then, of course, Miss Marple, seated near a rose bush that was, in her private opinion, slightly overwatered. The morning conversation flowed like tea being poured, polite, pleasant, and never quite sincere. Such weather for a gathering, Mrs. Tilling declared, fanning herself though the air was quite cool. The roses are divine. Though of course roses never grow like this without help, and help always comes with stories. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mrs. Tilling was not wrong. The bishop raised his teacup, intending to speak, but at that moment, a late arrival hurried through the garden gate. Mr. Julian Carrington, a tall man with impeccably tailored clothes and the slightly too pleasant smile of someone used to persuading rooms to his advantage. He was a recent figure in the village, having purchased the old manor on the hill. He claimed to be a historian, though that claim rested mostly on his own tongue. The bishop's expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, before he welcomed the latecomer. Miss Marple noticed. She also noticed Mrs. Everdane's hand tightening around her teaspoon, but she said nothing. Not yet. Breakfast continued. Eggs, scones, light laughter. A violinist played softly near the terrace. No one, observing from a distance, would have suspected anything amiss, until the bishop rose to propose a toast. To fellowship, he said warmly, lifting his teacup. To kindness. He stopped. His voice caught on the word, and then storm, with the unmistakable slow horror of something dawning too late. The bishop clutched the edge of the table. The fine china rattled, His face paled, then flushed, then drained of color entirely. Mrs. Everdene screamed. The bishop collapsed onto the gravel path, his teacup spilling dark amber tea across the stones like an unfinished blessing. For one suspended moment, there was silence. Birdsong, a breeze among the roses, a dropped napkin fluttering to the grass. Then chaos. Colonel Fenton shouted for space. Edmund Pritchard knelt beside the bishop, frantic. Mrs. Tilling gasped and immediately began whispering to no one in particular, her appetite for drama struggling with her evident shock. Miss Marple did not rush forward. She simply observed how Mrs. Everdene fell to her knees, not in hysteria, but with the grief of someone who had feared this moment long before it occurred. How Edmund's hands shook too violently to be helpful. Young grief, unprepared and unknowing. How Julian Carrington stayed too far back, not shocked, but watchful. And how Miss Lydia Marsh looked not surprised, but frightened. Within minutes, Dr. Harold Wenton, who had attended the gathering as well, pronounced what everyone feared. The bishop was dead. Mrs. Everdene sobbed softly. It must have been his heart. He has been overworked. No, Dr. Wenton said grimly, his voice cut cleanly through the whispers. This was not natural. The garden froze. Someone knocked over a teacup. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on her own cup, her expression thoughtful, calm, almost sorrowful, because she had seen it, too, the smallest detail, a detail no one else had noticed, not yet. The garden did not empty quickly. Even as Dr. Wenton covered the bishop's still form respectfully with a folded linen cloth, the guests lingered like startled birds, unsure whether to flee or cling to one another. The roses swayed in the light breeze, serene and indifferent, as though death were simply another change in the weather. The violinist had stopped playing. The last trembling note seemed to hang in the air long after the bow was lowered. Mrs. Everdene was escorted gently into the house by Lydia Marsh, who supported her with a steadying arm. Lydia's face remained pale, but her movements were precise, deliberate. She did not tremble. Miss Marple watched with quiet interest. Grief can tell as much about a person as guilt. Colonel Fenton tried to assume command, barking instructions more for the sake of the image than necessity. Edmund Pritchard remained kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, though his whispered words were lost beneath the rising murmur of speculation. Mrs. Tilling, her voice lowered but urgent, began cataloguing suspicions before the bishop's body was cold. Heart trouble, perhaps, though Dr. Wenton said it wasn't natural. Poison, you think? One hears about poisonings in country houses. Always something in the tea, isn't it? Miss Marple did not correct her. She simply observed the teapot, the cups, the plate of lemon-curd tarts that had been the bishop's clear favorite. A slight residue along the rim of the bishop's teacup was visible, if one cared to look. A faint ring that had not been present before he raised it in toast. The police were summoned with reluctance. Death was unwelcome in St. Oswald's Hollow, not because it was unusual, but because it was untidy. It brought truths to the surface like mud stirred in a pond. When Inspector Harold Fitch arrived from the nearby town of Bramblewood, he did so with the weary seriousness of a man who expected nothing more dramatic than petty theft and missing chickens. He was broad-shouldered, dependable, and possessed of the unimpressed expression of someone who disliked theatrics in any form. A tragedy, he said after the initial examination, removing his hat respectfully. But we must be clear-headed. Dr. Wenton believes poison. If so, we will find the source. Mrs. Tilling was eager, almost gleeful. Well, all the village was here. Anyone could have... Which means... Inspector Fitch interrupted firmly. We begin with the immediate circle, those closest to the bishop. This pronouncement caused a ripple. Subtle, but sharply felt. Miss Marple noted reactions. Edmund Pritchard looked stricken, as though the mere suggestion of suspicion was sacrilege. Colonel Fenton stiffened, affronted at being included in anything less dignified than honor. Lydia Marsh lowered her gaze, thoughtful, controlled. Julian Carrington's expression did not change at all, and that was, in its way, rather telling. The inspector took statements in the drawing room, where the windows overlooked the same roses that had witnessed the bishop's final breath. The scent of the flowers drifted in, almost cloyingly sweet. Mrs. Everdene sat nearest the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly. Her voice was fragile but steady as she described the morning. She spoke of her husband's good health, his occasional fatigue, his habits, his quiet joys. Nothing seemed out of place, except that each sentence felt measured, as though she were walking carefully across thin ice. Edmund was next. Earnest, emotional, full of admiration. He spoke of the bishop's kindness, his guidance, his wisdom. But when pressed about any recent disagreements or conflicts, Edmund hesitated, only for the briefest moment. Yet hesitation is a language Miss Marple spoke fluently. "I wouldn't call it a conflict," he said finally. "More a difference of opinion regarding church funds. A donation promised to be used for restoration. I believed it should go toward the orphan fund." The bishop disagreed, but it was only a discussion. Inspector Fitch made a note. Colonel Fenton declared the world was full of cowards and criminals, and any number of them might have reason to harm a bishop, especially one who spoke publicly on matters of conscience. The inspector allowed him to talk until his indignation ran its course. Lydia spoke gently, simply. She had been helping Mrs. Everdene with church bookkeeping since her return to the village. Yes, she had known the bishop before she left, though only faintly. Yes, she had observed some tension among church board members, but nothing, she insisted, that suggested danger. It was Julian Carrington's turn that quieted the room. He crossed one leg over the other, perfectly composed. "I had only the warmest respect for the bishop," he said. We had spoken several times. He was a man of intellect, which is regrettably rare in clergy. His death is tragic, but I assure you, Inspector, I have no insight to offer. The inspector frowned. "And you arrived late today?" "Yes," Julian replied smoothly. "A business letter required my immediate attention." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Everdene's reaction to those words. It was small, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of something sharp, not grief, recognizing pain, but the inspector did not notice. When it was Miss Marple's turn, she spoke softly, as though discussing gardening rather than murder. "It was a very lovely breakfast," she began, though the bishop did seem distracted, and Mrs. Everdene appeared anxious, which is rarely a state produced overnight. And that teacup of his, the one with the gold rim, it was not the one he began the morning with. Inspector Fitch looked up sharply. Julian Carrington's fingers, resting loosely on his knee, curled inward. And Miss Marple continued, pleasantly as though sharing a recipe. Someone took great care to exchange it when no one appeared to be looking. The change was subtle, but one becomes quite attuned to noticing what others choose to overlook. A silence settled, heavy, measured, expectant. Even the roses outside seemed to hold their breath. The investigation had begun in earnest. The room did not erupt the way one might expect after such a statement. Instead, there came a subtle tightening of space, as though every person present had drawn inward at once. A shift in air, delicate but unmistakable. Miss Marple had not accused. She had merely observed, and yet the implication hovered like a quiet draft, under a closed door. Felt, but not spoken. Inspector Fitch cleared his throat. "You are certain, Miss Marple? The teacup was changed?" "Yes," she answered mildly. The bishop began with the cup bearing the crest of St. Alban, the little engraving near the handle. But when he toasted, his cup had no crest at all. The change occurred after the first round of scones, when Mrs. Tilling was telling Colonel Fenton about her cousin in Bath, who eloped with a footman. Everyone was listening. No one was watching the table. Mrs. Tilling blinked in astonishment, hands rising to her chest. I had no idea my story was so distracting. Colonel Fenton snorted. "It was excessive, Agatha. It always is." She huffed, though not indignantly, more with the embarrassed thrill of having played a notable part in history, however indirectly. Inspector Fitch scribbled something, though it was clear from the set of his jaw that he had not noticed the cups himself. Miss Marple's knowledge was inconvenient, though undeniably important. "Which means," Fitch said slowly, "the poison was administered specifically to the bishop. Not a random act, nor an accident." Lydia Marsh, seated beside the quiet fireplace, raised her head. She spoke softly. "If that is true, then whoever did this not only intended to kill him, they intended to ensure no one else could possibly drink from that cup." It was a reasonable observation. Too reasonable, and Miss Marple's eyes, gentle as always, lingered on her for only a moment longer than courtesy required. The questioning concluded soon after. Guests were permitted to leave the bishop's residence, though asked to remain within the village. The garden remained eerily undisturbed. Chairs still neatly in place, plates arranged, roses blooming without care for the tragedy they had borne witness to. Miss Marple strolled slowly down the gravel lane toward the village square. She did not hurry. Observation seldom required haste. The morning sun had climbed higher. The warmth was pleasant, though the air felt thinner now, stretched between what was known and what had been hidden. She paused near the churchyard gate, where Edmund Pritchard stood alone, staring at the old stone archway as if it held answers. His posture was young, not in years, but in that unguarded way, grief sits openly upon the shoulders of those who have not yet learned to carry it privately. "He was very dear to you," Miss Marple said gently as she approached. Edmund startled, then nodded. "He guided me. He was more than a superior." "I don't—" His voice broke. "I don't understand why anyone would do this." Miss Marple allowed a moment of quiet to settle. Sometimes silence gave truths room to surface. Sometimes wrongdoing, she said softly, is not rooted in hatred, but in fear, or shame, or desperation. One might commit a terrible act to protect something they believe cannot withstand the light. Edmund wiped his eyes. "Do you think someone he trusted?" She did not answer directly. "Tell me, Mr. Pritchard, the bishop and Mr. Carrington, how did they know each other?" Edmund's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition, a truth already known, simply unspoken. "They met months ago. Mr. Carrington visited the bishop often, late evenings in the study. I never heard their conversations, but—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. The bishop was distressed afterward, quiet, withdrawn. Mrs. Everdene worried. She confided once that there was something from the bishop's past he wished would remain buried. Miss Marple did not press him further. She merely nodded. Secrets once stirred do not settle easily. Edmund looked at her then, truly looked, as though only now realizing that beneath her soft manner and grandmotherly features, she was not merely kind, she was perceptive in ways others were not. "Miss Marple, do you believe this was about that past?" She smiled gently, the smallest upturn of the lips. "I believe that when one wishes fiercely enough to hide something, The cost of silence can grow very steep indeed. He swallowed hard, her words landing with the weight of something understood too late. Miss Marple left him with his thoughts and continued on toward the vicarage, where the curtains had been drawn. Mrs. Everdene would be there, and a grieving wife, if grief is indeed what she felt, often reveals truths unintentionally. But before she reached the gate, she heard the hurried footsteps of Inspector Fitch approaching behind her. "Miss Marple," he called, breath slightly winded, a word. She turned, folding her hands lightly together. "We found something," he said, "something in the bishop's study." His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it, a strain of unease. A sealed letter addressed to Mr. Julian Carrington. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though no surprise flickered in them at all. A letter, unopened. The past was beginning to speak. Inspector Fitch did not open the letter in the street. He tucked it carefully inside his coat as though its very paper might crumble under mishandling. But the tension in his jaw betrayed the shift in the investigation, from speculation to pursuit. Miss Marple walked beside him toward the bishop's study, her steps measured, her expression faintly thoughtful. She had always found that written words carried a peculiar gravity, not only for what they said, but for what they chose not to say. Inside the study the air was still. Dust motes hung suspended in a single beam of light, cutting through the half-drawn curtains. The bishop's desk had been left as it was that morning. An open book of scripture, a reading lamp, a pair of spectacles still resting atop a folded page, as though he might return at any moment to continue where he had left off. The letter lay on the desk, sealed with simple wax. No flourish, no decorative stamp, merely the firm, deliberate hand of a man who knew precisely who was meant to receive it. Julian Carrington. Inspector Fitch broke the seal. The paper inside was unremarkable. The words, however, were not. "My dear Mr. Carrington, your request places me in a moral position I cannot accept. Whatever occurred in the past must not be concealed for personal advantage. I cannot, and will not, sign the statement you drafted. To do so would violate not only the trust of my own conscience, but the laws of God Himself. I urge you to reconsider your path, for I cannot assist you further." There was no anger in the writing, only sorrow, but at the bottom, in one brief line, something else, sharper, heavier. "You once asked me if truth can be forgiven. I believe it can, but only if first it is spoken." Inspector Fitch exhaled slowly. His eyes narrowed. He refused Carrington something important enough for murder. Miss Marple said nothing immediately. She touched the corner of the letter, gently, thoughtfully, and then let her gaze drift across the study. There were no signs of struggle, no disarray, but on a shelf near the far wall, among neat rows of leather-bound volumes, one book was slightly out of alignment, not dramatically, but enough that someone with a habit for order would have noticed. She stepped to the shelf, withdrew it carefully, a parish record, but not of recent years. This one dated back more than 3 decades. She opened it. The ink was faded, the handwriting of another era. Christenings, marriages, confirmations. Ordinary life, etched in quiet strokes, until one entry, near the middle of the book, bore a faint impression as though a page had once rested against it. A letter placed between its leaves, often enough to leave its shadow in the paper. A birth record, a mother's name, the father's name, curiously, left blank. Miss Lydia Marsh, not her own birth. Miss Marple knew that immediately. The dates did not match, but a child born out of wedlock, recorded quietly, hidden quietly, And then no further trace, no death record, no adoption, nothing. Miss Marple closed the book, turning it slowly in her hands. A secret once buried rarely stays silent when the soil is disturbed. Inspector Fitch had noticed the change in her eyes. "You know something." "I know," she replied softly, "that people carry their past with great tenderness, Inspector. Some try to protect it, some try to bury it, some try to turn it into something more advantageous. Carrington?" he pressed. "Perhaps," she allowed, but her voice remained gentle, or perhaps not alone. Footsteps sounded in the doorway. Julian Carrington stood there. No announcement, no hesitation. He had come of his own accord. His expression was composed, but not calm. Something lay behind his eyes that had not been there at breakfast. Pressure, calculation, and the faint tremor of someone accustomed to being in control, now finding the ground uneven beneath him. "I heard the letter was found," he said. Inspector Fitch moved as though to block his approach, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Not commanding, merely knowing. Julian walked forward. The bishop was a wise man, and a stubborn one. He believed the truth must always come to light, a fine principle for those who have nothing to lose. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "And you, Mr. Carrington, what is it you fear losing?" His smile did not quite hold. "Everything," he said quietly. He looked up then, not at Fitch, but at Miss Marple. "As I suspect you already understand." She did not deny it, but neither did she accuse, because a truth revealed too soon harms the telling of it. And Miss Marple, above all, understood timing. Julian glanced toward the window, where the church spire cut cleanly against the sky. The bishop believed that exposing the past frees the spirit. His voice lowered, but exposure can destroy the living long before it redeems them. He took one step back, not fleeing but withdrawing. "Ask Lydia Marsh," he said, finally, "if you want to understand why he died." He left without another word. Inspector Fitch swore under his breath. "So he's blaming her now?" Miss Marple looked down at the parish record in her hands, her expression as calm as the still water of a deep well. "No, Inspector," she murmured. "He is warning us." Outside, the church bell began to toll. A slow, resonant morning for the bishop. In the village below, whispers had already begun. The tolling of the bell drifted through the study window, low and steady, as if the village itself was breathing in and out with grief it didn't yet understand. Miss Marple closed the parish record and held it lightly against her chest, the way one holds something fragile, not because it might break, but because it might reveal too much if handled carelessly. Inspector Fitch ran a hand over his face. "I'll have to question Miss Marsh again, if she knows something." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "If you question her now, Inspector, she will tell you what she believes is safest to say. People speak truth only when they believe they are unobserved, or when they are tired of running from it." Fitch looked at her, puzzled but listening. It was one of his better qualities. When experience reached its limit, he did not pretend otherwise. "She helped Mrs. Everdene inside," Miss Marple continued. "That is where she will be now. It is where she feels her duty lies." She glanced toward the hallway. "We should allow her to continue that role. Comfort loosens the tongue, while interrogation merely hardens it." Fitch hesitated, then nodded, conceding the point. Miss Marple set the parish record back upon the shelf. Not exactly as it had been, but not enough to disturb suspicion. Some truths needed to be coaxed into daylight, not dragged. They found Lydia Marsh in the vicarage sitting room. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing soft, muted light to spill across the carpet. Mrs. Everdene sat in a high-backed chair, her face pale, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap, as though she feared they might betray her by trembling. Lydia knelt beside her, steadying her, a soft voice whispering reassurances no one could quite hear. When Lydia looked up, her expression did not change, but her eyes did. A flicker, brief as a candle's tremor. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Inspector," she said quietly. "Miss Marple." Mrs. Everdene tried to straighten, though grief weighed her down. "Have you learned anything? Anything at all?" Fitch opened his mouth. But it was Miss Marple who answered. "We have learned," she said softly, "that your husband was carrying a burden, one that reached back many years, and that this burden was connected to someone in this room." Silence settled like snowfall, soft but absolute. Mrs. Everdene's breath caught. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it would follow us. Malcolm tried so hard to—" The rest dissolved into tears. Lydia stood slowly. There was no denial, no shock, only a long, quiet exhale, the kind one makes when ending a vigil that has gone on far too long. "He helped me," she said, "long ago, when I had nowhere else to go." Mrs. Everdene pressed a handkerchief to her lips, but her eyes stayed fixed, not on Lydia, but on something remembered. Lydia continued, voice steady, because steadiness was how one survived. "I had a child, a daughter, born here in the village. I was young, foolish perhaps. The father was—" She stopped. Her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the hill where the Carrington Manor sat, its silhouette sharp against the pale sky. Inspector Fitch blinked. "Carrington." Lydia nodded once. "My family sent me away. Whispered solutions, urged erasure. I refused. The bishop hid us. Found a home for my daughter, far from here. No one knew but him and Mrs. Everdene." Mrs. Everdene lowered her head, a confirmation without words. "And Mr. Carrington?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He returned," Lydia said, voice tightening, not as the frightened young man he had been, but as someone who believed that money and reputation could rewrite the past. "He wanted the bishop to sign a statement saying the child did not exist, that I had lied, that my word meant nothing." Mrs. Everdene's fingers trembled. "The bishop refused," Lydia murmured. "Of course he refused." Inspector Fitch looked stricken. "So Carrington—" Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the conclusion before it could form fully. "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not yet. Wanting a thing does not prove one acted to obtain it. Desire is not guilt. Opportunity is not proof. And fear—" Her gaze drifted to Mrs. Everdene. "Fear is its own kind of silence." Something passed across the widow's face. Fragile, fleeting, but unmistakable. A secret held too tightly. Miss Marple looked at her gently, with the kindness of someone who understands what it means to love someone deeply, even when loving them hurts. "Mrs. Everdene," she said quietly, "why did you change the teacup?" The room did not explode. It simply stopped. Lydia froze. Inspector Fitch's breath caught. Mrs. Everdene did not sob. She closed her eyes, and the truth came out on the smallest exhale, like a confession given to God in the quiet corner of a church. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I meant only to stop him." The roses outside swayed again, gentle and indifferent, as human sorrow unfolded within the walls that once held peace. Mrs. Everdene's confession did not come as a dramatic outpouring, but rather as something long, worn down, shaped smooth by sleepless nights and the grinding pressure of fear. She remained seated in the high-backed chair, her hands still folded tightly, as though she were bracing herself against the memory she had kept. Caged. Inspector Fitch's voice was quiet when he spoke, almost cautious. "Stop him from what, Mrs. Everdene?" Her eyes opened slowly. They were tired in a way no grief alone could produce. "From telling the truth," she whispered, "from tearing our lives apart." Lydia's breath caught. "You knew," she murmured. "You always knew." Mrs. Everdene nodded. "Malcolm told me everything, the moment it happened. He believed confession was the first step to forgiveness, and Her voice trembled. "I believed marriage meant loyalty, so I forgave him, or at least, I tried to." Miss Marple's expression did not change. Her voice was soft enough not to wound. "He was the father." The widow closed her eyes in acknowledgement. Lydia's hands gripped the back of the nearest chair, not with anger, but with the shattering realization of something she had never dared to name. "My daughter," Lydia whispered, barely audible. "He didn't abandon her. He protected her." Mrs. Everdane's head lowered. "He visited her in secret. He sent money, letters, but the guilt, it ate at him. I feared." Her words faltered. "I feared he would break under Carrington's pressure, that he would confess publicly. If the church learned he had fathered a child before our marriage, even out of compassion and remorse, they would have destroyed him, and me, and everything we built." Inspector Fitch remained still, listening. He did not interrupt. That silence was the only kindness he had to offer. "So," Mrs. Everdene continued, her voice now thin as the edge of a page, "I slipped the tincture into the teacup, just enough to make him ill. Only to keep him from speaking at the breakfast, to delay things, to give us time, a day, an hour, I thought." She covered her face with her hands. "I thought it would weaken him, not stop his heart." Lydia took a step forward, not in accusation but in stunned disbelief. "You tried to save him," she said quietly, "and instead—" "I killed him," Mrs. Everdene whispered. The words lay softly between them, heavy as stone. Yet Miss Marple did not look at the widow with condemnation. Her gaze was thoughtful, clear, unwavering. The gaze of someone who had seen many varieties of sin and many varieties of love. "It was digitalis, wasn't it?" she said gently. Mrs. Everdene nodded without looking up. "He took it for his heart. Sometimes. Only a little. I thought a little more would only make him faint. I didn't know. I didn't understand the dosage." Miss Marple sighed, not in judgment, but in sorrow. "That is the trouble with medicines that save lives. The same measure that heals can also kill." Inspector Fitch straightened. His job required him to stand firm now. "Mrs. Everdene, you will need to come with me. You understand that." She nodded calmly, almost with relief. The secret was no longer hers to hold, but Lydia stepped forward, her hand gripping the inspector's sleeve. "She was trying to protect him," she said. "Protect all of us. Carrington threatened everything. He forced this." Fitch looked at her, jaw tight. "The law will consider every circumstance. But the bishop is dead, Miss Marsh. Intention does not erase that." Lydia's eyes shimmered, but she did not argue further. Mrs. Everdene rose on unsteady feet. It was Miss Marple who reached out to help her, gentle, supportive, guiding her as though escorting someone to their pew on a Sunday morning rather than into custody. When the door shut behind them, the room felt hollow. Lydia remained by the window, staring toward the hill where Carrington's manor stood. The clouds passing overhead cast slow-moving shadows across the grass. She never should have had to carry this alone, Lydia whispered. Miss Marple touched her arm. A small gesture, but steadying. Secrets rarely stay singular, my dear. They spread, they stain, they pull others in whether they are prepared or not. Lydia nodded, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. But, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle, yet unmistakably firm, Mrs. Everdene did not kill the bishop. Lydia stiffened, but she said, "She confessed to what she believed," Miss Marple corrected softly, but the symptoms were too swift. Digitalis acts differently, and poisoning by substitution leaves traces that do not match faintness, but collapse. Lydia turned, confusion and fear knitting together. "Someone else tampered with the cup," Miss Marple said. "After she dosed it, someone who knew exactly how to turn hesitation into death." Outside, the morning bell tolled one final time. The true killer was still in St. Oswald's Hollow. Lydia stood, very still, her hands clasped in front of her, the color drained from her cheeks. The idea of a second hand in this tragedy seemed almost unbearable. Behind her, the quiet tick of the mantel clock filled the room, steady and unbothered, as though time itself refused to be moved by human grief. "You mean," Lydia whispered, "someone knew what she had done and made it worse?" Miss Marple nodded softly. Her tone was gentle, but her words held the firm clarity of truth. "Mrs. Everdene added the tincture, hoping only to delay the bishop. But the reaction we saw, the suddenness, that is not the result of mere misjudgment. That was a decisive dose. Someone added to what she gave him." Lydia sank slowly into the nearest chair, her breathing shallow. But who would know? Who would have seen? Someone who noticed what she did, or someone who expected she might. Miss Marple stepped toward the fireplace, her gaze drawn to the faint ash smudge on the hearthstone. A recently burned scrap not yet swept away. It wasn't dramatic enough to comment on yet, but she filed it away in thought. "The cup was changed," Miss Marple continued. "That means opportunity, and the only people who were close enough, unnoticed enough, and calm enough to do so were those accustomed to remaining in the background of scenes like these." Lydia lifted her gaze. The name that rose to her lips did so silently, but Miss Marple saw it. "Edmund," Lydia breathed, horrified at hearing her own thought aloud, but Miss Marple did not confirm. The curate had access to the bishop at all hours. He also knew the bishop's medicine cabinet. He may have understood the effects better than Mrs. Everdene, but understanding alone does not prove guilt. Lydia shook her head slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. He loved the bishop. He admired him. Miss Marple waited. People reveal truth when they speak freely, and Lydia was, in that moment, terribly unguarded, unless he believed the bishop was going to leave him, or disgrace him, or... Her voice halted, something dark forming behind her eyes. There was the matter of the funds, the disagreement. He said it was only a discussion, but... His hands shook at the body, Miss Marple added softly, not only from grief, from fear. Lydia looked up sharply. Fear of being discovered. Miss Marple inclined her head, neither confirming nor denying, or fear of being responsible. The door to the hallway creaked, and both women turned. Edmund Pritchard stood there, his expression pale, his hair wind-tossed, as though he had walked quickly from the churchyard. His eyes were red but dry. A man past tears, hollowed out, I heard. His voice was raw. They took Mrs. Everdene. Lydia rose, startled, instinctively stepping back. Edmund's gaze flicked to her movement, and pain crossed his face. Do you think I would hurt her? Or him? His voice cracked. Miss Marple, you don't believe that. Miss Marple regarded him with the calm, unblinking gentleness of someone who has seen many masks, and the fragile faces beneath them. I believe, she said softly, that grief and guilt often stand side by side, and one can look very much like the other. Edmund swallowed. His hands trembled again, not wildly, but in tiny betraying motions. I loved him, he said. He was everything I hoped I could be. But he was weaker than I believed. He wanted to confess, to ruin himself, to ruin the church, to ruin me. Lydia stared. You knew about the child. Edmund nodded slowly, despairingly. He told me. He said truth mattered more than reputation, more than duty. He said grace could mend what honesty broke. But his voice fell to a whisper. I have given my entire life to being seen as good. I cannot survive being seen as anything else. Silence expanded. Quiet, immense, final. Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. So you waited. And when Mrs. Everdene, out of fear, did something foolish, you did something deliberate. Edmund's shoulders slumped. There was no outrage, no denial, only release. I only meant to prevent the confession, he murmured. To save everything. I didn't think death was... He swallowed. But once the heart begins to fail, digitalis is a knife that keeps cutting. Lydia pressed her hands to her mouth, tears catching in her lashes. Edmund looked between them and smiled a fragile, breaking smile. Do you know what's most dreadful? He whispered. I don't know if I regret it. His voice dissolved. He lowered his head, and for the first time, he looked very young. Miss Marple did not touch him. Her compassion did not extend to absolution. It never had. Come, Mr. Pritchard, she said softly. It is time to tell the inspector what you have told us. The curate nodded, his steps slow, each one heavier than the last. The door closed behind them with a quiet snap. Lydia remained by the window again, staring toward the bishop's roses. Still blooming, still indifferent. The village bell did not ring this time. It did not have to. The truth had already sounded. The afternoon light drained slowly from the village, as though the day itself felt the weight of what had been uncovered. Inspector Fitch escorted Edmund Pritchard through the vicarage gate with a somber, respectful silence. There was no struggle, no protest. Edmund walked with the steady, resigned steps of a man who had already been judged, not by law, but by his own conscience. Miss Marple remained in the sitting room, seated now where Mrs. Everdene had been only moments before. Lydia stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly, as if trying to hold herself together from the inside. I never imagined, Lydia whispered, her voice fragile and strained. He seemed so devoted, so earnest. Miss Marple nodded, not in agreement but in understanding. The wish to be good, she said softly, can be a very dangerous thing when it is built on the fear of appearing otherwise, when reputation becomes more sacred than the truth. People begin to justify the most terrible acts, believing they are preserving something righteous. Lydia lowered into a chair, her composure cracking. I should have told him sooner. I should have spoken about her, about my daughter. Perhaps then... No, Miss Marple interrupted gently. You must not carry his choice as your burden. Hearts break in private, my dear, and the pieces can cut when someone tries to hide them. Lydia pressed her hands against her eyes, shaking. Miss Marple allowed her the silence. Consolation, she knew, was not always spoken. Sometimes it was simply shared space, waiting without pressing. Footsteps sounded on the gravel outside, sharp, confident, practiced, not Edmund's, not Fitch's. Julian Carrington stepped into the sitting room, hat in hand, his expression carefully arranged, too composed for the circumstance, too calm to be natural. "I heard," he said quietly. "They've taken him into custody." Miss Marple observed him for a moment. His posture was shaped by habit, charm, ready in reserve, poise honed for parlors and negotiations. But his eyes were guarded now, alert, prepared. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Edmund has admitted his part." A faint exhale left Julian. Not a breath of relief, nor sorrow. Something more complicated, something like calculation loosening its grip. "It's all very tragic," Julian murmured. "But inevitable, I suppose. Emotional young men are prone to extremes." Lydia stiffened. Her gaze did not leave him. Something cold had replaced her earlier grief. "You pushed the bishop," she said quietly. "Forced him toward confession. You threatened him." Julian's smile was thin. "I asked for accountability. That is hardly a crime." Miss Marple spoke before Lydia could answer. "But what you asked him to sign was not accountability, Mr. Carrington. It was erasure." He turned to her, and for the first time, the veneer shifted, not fully, but enough. "If the past came to light," he said softly, "I would lose everything. Everything I have built, everything I am." "You already lost it," Miss Marple replied, equally soft, "the moment you believed your dignity depended on silence." He swallowed, a small motion, but revealing. But he did not argue again. Instead, he stepped closer to Lydia. "I did not harm him," he said. And the strange thing was, it sounded honest. "I intended to protect myself, but I did not touch the tea. I did not poison him." Lydia's jaw trembled, not from uncertainty, but from exhaustion. "And yet you let another take the blame." Julian's gaze shifted, a quiet admission without words. He looked at Miss Marple. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked softly. "When I arrived late, when I didn't rush forward, when I watched?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "That is when I knew you had something to hide. But not murder." Julian bowed his head. The fight was gone. He turned without another word and left the house, not escaping, not defeated, but exposed. Lydia watched him go, her voice barely a breath. "What happens now?" Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. A small, habitual motion. "Truth," she said, "has a way of settling into place, even when it comes late. Mrs. Everdene will face judgment, yes, but leniency may follow given intention. Edmund will answer for what he has done, and Mr. Carrington, well, the world has a way of undoing men who fear their own reflection." Lydia stood slowly. Her eyes, though red, were steady. "And my daughter?" she asked. "What happens to her part in all of this?" Miss Marple's expression softened, and for the first time, warmth, not grief, filled her tone. "She lives," she said, "and she is loved. That is what matters. The past may shape a life, but it does not define it. You will find your way to her again when the time is right." A long silence settled, but this one was lighter, almost bearable. Outside, the roses swayed in the evening breeze, petals catching the last of the fading light. Life in St. Oswald's Hollow would not return to what it had been, but it would continue. Quietly, Miss Marple stepped toward the door. There was still one thing left to be done, and she knew exactly where to go. Miss Marple left the vicarage just as the sky dipped into the softer shades of late afternoon. The air had grown cooler, and the faint scent of roses still lingered, though the garden felt different now. Its beauty touched by sorrow. She did not walk toward the village square or the constable's office. Her path led instead toward the bishop's garden. Quiet now, tables cleared, chairs stacked to one side. The violinist was gone. Only the gravel remained disturbed, where footsteps had hurried and faltered. Miss Marple paused near the small stone bench beneath the largest rose arbor. A single teacup sat there, overlooked, half hidden among petals that had fallen from above. She picked it up gently. The faintest residue clung to the inside rim. A second ring, layered over the first. Mrs. Everdane's tincture had been added before breakfast began, but this second ring was formed later, very subtly, very precisely. The bishop had drunk twice. Someone had ensured the first dose became fatal. Miss Marple set the cup back exactly where she'd found it. She understood now, not only how, but why. The church bell tower door opened with a soft groan behind her as Inspector Fitch approached, his steps deliberate, knowing she would be here. "You found something," he said. Though the question was unnecessary, Miss Marple nodded. Edmund acted out of fear, but he acted in the moment. Someone else acted with intention. Someone who saw what Mrs. Everdane had done and chose to finish it, not to prevent scandal, but for an entirely different reason. Fitch exhaled, bracing himself. "Who?" Miss Marple looked toward the house, toward the window of the bishop's study still half open to the evening breeze. Mrs. Everdane believed she was protecting her marriage. Miss Marple said softly. Edmund believed he was protecting his standing, but there was someone for whom the bishop's confession would have unraveled far more than reputation. Fitch's brow knit slowly. "Carrington?" "No." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "He feared disgrace, yes, but disgrace can be survived. No, the one who could not survive exposure was the one who had lived her whole life beside him, the woman who knew every sermon he preached, every choice he had made, every secret he had wrestled with." Fitch stared at her. "Mrs. Everdane," he breathed, but Miss Marple's answer came quietly, firmly, without cruelty. "No, Inspector, Mrs. Everdane did not kill her husband." She turned slightly, listening to the whisper of the wind through the roses. She meant to delay him, to buy time, to hold a life together one more day. Fitch's voice dropped. "Then who?" Miss Marple spoke the name gently, as one would with a truth that had been waiting to be heard. Lydia Marsh. The garden was still. She had the greatest to lose. Miss Marple continued, voice calm, patient. Not her reputation, not her place in the village, but her daughter. If the bishop confessed publicly, her child's name would become the center of gossip, scorn, and scandal. A life would be defined by a past decision neither of them chose. Lydia had already lost her once. She would not lose her again. Fitch swallowed, realization settling heavily. She was close to the tea service all morning, helping, steadying Mrs. Everdane. He closed his eyes. She saw the dose, recognized it, and added the rest. Miss Marple nodded. She knew how digitalis worked. She had been the one to help administer it to the bishop on his weaker days. She knew the measure, and she altered it. The inspector's grief was not personal, and yet it was real. The grief of a man who wished the world were kinder, more straightforward, less human. "Lydia Marsh," he said quietly, "I took a life to protect a child." "She took a life," Miss Marple replied, equally quietly, "for love and fear and desperation. All three together make a potent poison, Inspector, far more than any tincture." They walked back toward the vicarage together. No door slammed. No accusations rang out. No raised voices. Lydia opened the door before they even knocked. She had washed her face, smoothed her dress and folded her hands calmly before her. She had known this moment was coming long before Miss Marple spoke her name. Her voice was steady. "I will go with you." Miss Marple did not speak. She merely gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of respect for what Lydia had chosen to admit without being told. As Lydia stepped past them, she paused. "Do you believe," she asked Miss Marple softly, "that God will forgive me?" Miss Marple looked at her with eyes neither harsh nor sentimental, only deeply, fully human. "I believe," she said, "that God understands." Lydia nodded once and walked toward her fate. The roses rustled in the evening air. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed in the fading light. The village breathed on. The evening settled slowly over St. Oswald's Hollow, as though the village itself wished to take a long, quiet breath before nightfall. Lamps flickered to life behind lace curtains. The faint smell of wood smoke drifted from hearths where kettles warmed for supper. Life resumed, not untouched, but quieter, gentler, as if the day's events had been folded into the very soil beneath their feet. Miss Marple walked home along the narrow lane lined with hawthorn hedges. The gravel crunched lightly beneath her sensible shoes. She felt neither triumph nor heaviness, only the familiar thoughtful stillness that followed the resolution of a tangled matter. Human nature had once again revealed itself in sorrow and complexity, and she had only helped to set the pieces where they belonged. When she reached her cottage, she paused at the gate. Her roses were not as extravagant as the bishop's, but they were tended with patient affection. She touched one bloom lightly with her fingertips. Too much rain, too little care, and even beauty withers. Too much pruning and nothing grows at all. Balance, always balance, was the quiet art of life. She found her kettle waiting on the stove, exactly where she had left it that morning. She set it to boil and moved with gentle familiarity around her kitchen. The house was peaceful. The world was not. But the world never truly had been. A soft knock came at her door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Fitch standing on her step, hattie in hand. His face bore none of the rigid formality of earlier, only a kind of fatigue common to those who have seen too much of what people are capable of. "I thought you'd be here," he said. She smiled faintly. "I do tend to return home after I've finished what I set out for." He exhaled, something between a sigh and a wry laugh, and stepped inside at her invitation. She poured tea. They drank in quiet for a moment. "It's done," Fitch said finally. Lydia confessed fully. Her reasoning was as you said. She believed if the bishop's confession became public, her daughter's life would be marked by shame she had no say in. She acted to protect a future. In a tragic way, I suppose. She succeeded. Miss Marple nodded. "There are many kinds of love, Inspector. Some heal, some protect, and some, when twisted by desperation, take on the shape of harm." Lydia acted not out of malice, but fear of losing love a second time. Fitch leaned back in his chair, rubbing his brow. "And Mrs. Everdene? She will live the rest of her life with the knowledge of how close she came to destroying what she loved most." Miss Marple said softly, "Punishment takes many forms. The courts will choose theirs. Her conscience will choose another. And Carrington?" Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the ripples settle. "He will learn the cost of building one's life atop the silence of others. The truth has a way of reaching us, even when we believe we have outrun it." The inspector nodded slowly. He had no argument left. They sat a moment longer, the quiet settling in comfortably. "You saw it all beginning at breakfast, didn't you?" he asked. "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Not all, but I have spent my life observing small things. The way a hand trembles, the way a look lingers, the way fear tries very hard to appear calm. People reveal themselves in the spaces between words." He considered that. "You make it sound simple," he said. "It isn't?" she answered, smiling faintly. "But people are, in the end, exactly who they are. Once you understand that, the rest becomes quite clear." The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Inspector Fitch finished his tea, stood, and placed his hat back upon his head. "Good night, Miss Marple." "Good night, Inspector." He stepped out into the soft dusk and disappeared down the lane. Miss Marple washed the cups, dried them carefully, and placed them back on their shelf. Then she went to her small sitting room and settled into her armchair beside the window. The evening star had appeared, bright and solitary, above the roofs of the village. She gazed at it, thoughtful but peaceful. People were complicated, loving, fearful, hopeful, flawed. She did not try to make sense of them all. She only observed, and in doing so, understood. Beyond the village, a nightingale began to sing. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and listened. The nightingale's song lingered softly in the quiet, and Miss Marple sat still for a time, letting the silence settle around her. Yet even silence in a village like St. Oswald's Hollow never stayed untouched for long. A soft rustle at her gate drew her attention. Someone approached with hesitant footsteps. Not hurried, not bold, simply careful. A knock followed. Light, as though the caller feared to disturb more than just a door. Miss Marple rose, opened it, and found Mrs. Tilling standing there, shawl wrapped close, eyes wide, not with gossip now, but caution. "I do apologize for calling so late," Mrs. Tilling said, though of course she had never once in her life apologized for calling at any hour. But tonight she looked genuinely unsettled. "I thought perhaps I should speak with you." Miss Marple stepped aside, inviting her in. Mrs. Tilling's usual fluttering gestures were muted, her hands folded neatly around a handkerchief, twisting it slowly. "It's about Lydia Marsh," she said at last. "The village will talk, Jane. They always do. They will say she was wicked, or deceitful, or cold. And she swallowed. "I saw her grow up. I knew her mother. I cannot bear to think she will be spoken of cruelly." Miss Marple sat with her, folding her own hands in her lap, voice warm and steady. "Then you must be the one to speak differently." Mrs. Tilling blinked at that. "Me? Oh, I don't know that anyone listens to me." "Oh, but they do," Miss Marple interrupted, with the lightest hint of amusement. "You have never noticed? You begin a whisper, and by sunset it is a considered opinion across every hearth in the village. You have always had influence, my dear. You simply have not always chosen what to do with it." Mrs. Tilling stared, not offended but surprised by the simple truth of it. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Tell them Lydia loved. Tell them love drove her wrong. Tell them she tried to protect a child, and others will say the same. The tale will soften, and in time, St. Oswald's Hollow will accept what it cannot forget." Mrs. Tilling drew a trembling breath and nodded. Something in her posture straightened. "A purpose formed where helplessness had been. I can do that," she said quietly. Yes, I can." They spoke a while longer, not of crime or guilt or scandal, but of gardens and the festival in July, and whether the church choir might be reorganized in autumn. Ordinary things returned gently, as ordinary life always does. When Mrs. Tilling left and the door closed again, the cottage returned to stillness. Miss Marple sat once more beside her window. The nightingale continued its patient, lovely song, yet she did not remain long. She rose, fetched her shawl, and stepped into the cool night air. The path to the church was familiar. She had walked it often, through joy and grief alike. The village lay quiet, houses sleeping beneath a soft wash of moonlight. She reached the old churchyard, where roses grew against the wall like a blessing laid in petals. She paused before a small bench and sat, folding her hands in her lap. From the belfry above, the faint creak of shifting wood sounded, an old building settling into night. Miss Marple looked toward the graves, toward the quiet resting places of those who had loved, erred, forgiven, broken, mended. There was no triumph in her heart, only remembrance, for every mystery solved is a life untangled, and every life untangled reveals something tender beneath the knot. She whispered, barely more than breath, "May peace find them all." The breeze stirred the roses, the nightingale answered, and St. Oswald's Hollow slept beneath the moon. A village changed, yet whole. The night lingered long and still, and by morning the village was already beginning the slow and hesitant work of returning to its rhythms. But some matters do not end with the closing of doors or the quieting of voices. They settle differently, like mist, layering themselves into the familiar. The following day brought a soft, hesitant sunlight, the kind that makes dew shine like glass beads on the hedges. Miss Marple was trimming her roses when she heard footsteps approach. These were not soft, nor shy, nor uncertain. They were brisk, measured, purposeful. Julian Carrington. He paused just outside her gate, his hat in one hand, though today he seemed less a man of presence and more a man without an anchor. His shoulders, always so straight, seemed to sag now under the quiet weight of consequence rather than guilt. "May I?" he asked simply. Miss Marple nodded and continued her work among the rose stems. He stepped inside the gate and stood beside her, allowing a few moments of silence. "The police will speak to me again this afternoon," he said, "about the letters, the pressure I applied, the damage I nearly caused." Miss Marple clipped a wilted bloom and set it aside. "They will likely admonish you, yes, but you did not kill the bishop." Julian exhaled, but there was no satisfaction in it. "No, but I pushed him to the brink. I pressed him when he was already unraveling. I believed I was owed something. I believed I could force the past into a shape that would suit me. And now?" Miss Marple asked gently. Julian looked out toward the lane, where a child's bicycle lay toppled in a patch of daisies, a simple scene. Innocent. He watched it with the quiet ache of someone realizing how far they had drifted from such simplicity. "Now," he said, "I will sell the manor. I will leave. St. Oswald's Hollow is too small to forget, and I no longer wish to be the reason it tries to." Miss Marple placed her pruning shears in her basket. "Running from truth is not the same as living with it." "No," Julian agreed, "but leaving might give me the chance to learn how to live with myself." She regarded him a moment. "Your daughter will grow. She may one day ask where she came from. The story she hears must be true. If you wish to be forgiven, Mr. Carrington, one day you must speak with her, plainly, honestly." He closed his eyes, jaw tightening, not from pain, but from the immense difficulty of choosing a better path when an easier one is simply to disappear. "I will," he said finally. "Not now, but I will." He tipped his hat, turned, and left, not hurried, not retreating, simply moving forward, as a man does when he has finally understood that his past is not the same as his purpose. Miss Marple watched him go, then knelt once more among her roses. She was not sentimental, but she felt the faint, steady warmth of satisfaction, not injustice done, nor guilt assigned. but in truths laid bare, where they could no longer wound in the dark. True healing rarely begins with punishment. It begins with understanding. Her quiet was interrupted again, this time by the slow creak of the garden gate. Edmund Pritchard's mother, Mrs. Pritchard, stood there now, small, grey, with trembling hands clasped tightly. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Miss Marple rose and took the woman's hands gently in her own. "Mothers," she said softly, "are often the last to know and the first to grieve." Mrs. Pritchard's tears fell silently. Miss Marple stood with her in the garden until the grief softened enough for breath. Later, when the day warmed and the village awoke fully, Miss Marple finally took her tea to the small table beneath her window. The world outside was still flawed, tender, human, but in its own way, it was healing. One truth, one broken heart, one quiet morning at a time, and in that slow, gentle mending, there was peace. The days that followed in St. Oswald's Hollow unfolded with a quiet steadiness, as though the village itself wished to place soft hands over the wounds left behind, not erasing them, but allowing them to settle into memory. The bishop was laid to rest under the great yew in the churchyard, where countless parishioners had stood before him. The villagers gathered in subdued silence, their heads bowed, not only in grief, but in contemplation of the complexities that had shaped his final days. Mrs. Everdene, though pale and fragile, was permitted to attend. She stood alone, her composure marked by a sorrow that required no explanation. Edmund Pritchard was not present. The law had taken him into custody, though he awaited judgment rather than condemnation, and Lydia Marsh, quiet and solemn, walked at the very back, escorted gently by a constable who, for all his uniform, seemed to understand the difference between guilt and heartbreak. Miss Marple sat near the front, hands folded neatly, her gaze soft and steady. She did not look upon the grief of the living or the stone marking the bishop's resting place. She watched instead the expressions that flickered across the faces of those gathered. The story of human nature did not end with death. It continued in the ripples of every choice afterward. After the service, the villagers dispersed slowly, voices low, steps measured. No gossip rose that day. Quiet had settled too deeply for that. Miss Marple made her way down the path toward the lane, where the grass grew thick and wildflowers brushed the hems of her skirt. She had no need to hurry. Life, she knew, always resumed in its own rhythm. As she reached the turn toward her cottage, she heard footsteps behind her. Slower, more tentative than those of the morning. Lydia Marsh approached, her expression calm but not hollow. "Miss Marple," she said, stopping at her side, "may I walk with you?" "Of course," Miss Marple answered gently. They walked together in silence for several moments. The road curved, the breeze stirred, and a blackbird traced an arc across the sky above. Finally Lydia spoke. When I saw him begin to falter, her voice was quiet, steady in its honesty. I wanted to stop. Truly I did. But by then, it was already done, and I knew that if he confessed, she would be lost. My daughter. She would be marked forever by something she never chose. Miss Marple did not rebuke her. There was nothing to be gained by reproach when a heart had already broken itself. "You acted from love," Miss Marple said softly, "but love, when frightened, can disguise itself as desperation, and desperation does not often see clearly." Lydia nodded. It was not agreement, nor regret, merely recognition. "Do you think," she asked quietly, "my daughter will ever forgive me?" Miss Marple looked ahead to where the path narrowed beneath a canopy of beech trees, sunlight forming shifting mosaics across the earth. "Children," she said gently, "forgive more easily than adults, and often more wisely, when she is grown and when the truth is told with care, not as confession, but as love. I believe she will understand." Lydia's breath trembled, but she did not cry. Some tears dry before they fall. They paused where their paths parted. "Thank you," Lydia whispered. Miss Marple's smile was soft, not triumphant, not consoling, simply present. "Go gently, my dear." Lydia nodded once, then walked away down the lane, her steps slow but certain. The steps of someone who had accepted what must come, and yet still chose to move forward. Miss Marple returned to her garden, where the roses waited, just as she had left them. She bent to trim a new bloom, soft pink, opening to morning light. She paused a moment, breathing in its quiet, tender fragrance. Human nature, she knew, was not black and white, never had been. It lived in the shaded spaces between grief and love, fear and hope, guilt and forgiveness, and perhaps that was why mysteries existed at all, to remind the world that truth is rarely a single, shining answer, but rather a collection of small, human choices. She placed the rose gently in a vase near her window, and as the late afternoon sunlight warmed the room, Miss Marple sat down with her knitting, the soft click of needles marking the peaceful return of ordinary life. The end.